Wrong decision, Black Waitress whispered to the billionaire. He never expected this $200 million loss. What if I told you that sometimes the most important advice comes from the most unexpected places? At Murphy's Diner on 5th Street, the coffee was always hot, the pie was homemade, and the regulars knew each other's stories by heart. But on that rainy Tuesday morning in October, something happened that would change everything for one of America's wealthiest men. Dorothy Jenkins had been pouring coffee and serving comfort food at Murphy's for 37 years. Her gentle smile and warm laugh had seen customers through divorces, job losses, and celebrations. She knew everyone's usual order, remembered their children's names, and had a gift for knowing exactly what people needed to hear. When 72-year-old billionaire Charles Whitman walked through those familiar doors that morning, his expensive suit dripping with rain, Dorothy sensed something was terribly wrong. Little did she know that her next words would cost him $200 million, and save something far more precious. Where are you watching from today? Charles Whitman hadn't always been a billionaire. 40 years ago, he'd been Charlie, a young man with calloused hands who'd saved every penny to buy his first small construction company. He'd built his empire one honest deal at a time, treating workers fairly and keeping his word. But success had slowly changed him, and somewhere along the way, Charlie had become Charles. Cold, calculating, and surrounded by people who only wanted his money. His wife Margaret had passed 2 years ago, and his children barely spoke to him anymore, too busy managing their trust funds to visit. That Tuesday morning, Charles sat in his usual corner booth at Murphy's, the same diner he'd been coming to since he was 25. It was the only place where people still called him Charlie, where nobody asked him for favors or investments. Dorothy approached with a coffee pot, noticing the deep lines of worry etched across his weathered face. "The usual, Charlie?" she asked gently, already knowing he'd want black coffee and whole wheat toast. But instead of his typical nod, Charles looked up with haunted eyes. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something," he said quietly. "You've got good sense about people. Always have." His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. 4 weeks, Charles had been wrestling with the biggest decision of his career. A massive development project in the old downtown district, the same neighborhood where Dorothy lived, where families had called home for generations. The project would demolish 20 blocks of affordable housing and small businesses, displacing hundreds of families. But it would also generate billions in revenue and cement his legacy as the most powerful developer in the state. The city council was meeting that afternoon, and Charles held the deciding vote. His lawyers assured him it was perfectly legal. His business partners were practically salivating at the projected profits. Everyone in his world was telling him the same thing. This was the deal of a lifetime. But something gnawed at him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe it was Margaret's voice in his head, reminding him of the man he used to be. Dorothy set down the coffee cup and studied his face. "What's eating at you, Charlie?" she asked softly. And in that moment, Charles realized he was about to make a choice that would define not just his fortune, but his soul. Charles pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase, his hands trembling slightly. Inside were architectural drawings, financial projections, and legal documents, everything needed to transform downtown into a gleaming commercial district. "It's all here, Dorothy. The biggest project I've ever been part of. But—" His voice trailed off as he stared at the papers. Dorothy glanced at the drawings and her face went pale. She recognized the street layouts, the little park where her grandchildren played, the community center where she volunteered on weekends. "Charlie, this is my neighborhood," she whispered. "These are our homes." Her voice wasn't angry, just deeply sad. "Mrs. Rodriguez who comes in here every Sunday after church, that's her apartment building right there. And the Thompsons, they've been in that house for 50 years. Charles felt his chest tighten. He'd known Dorothy lived downtown, but seeing her reaction made it real in a way the business meetings never had. "The lawyers say we can offer relocation assistance. Fair market value for the properties." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Fair market value? Dorothy sat down across from him, something she'd never done in 37 years of serving him. "Charlie, some things can't be bought and sold. Mrs. Rodriguez's late husband planted that garden behind their building with his own hands. The community center is where my grandson learned to read. The barbershop where old Mr. Franklin has been cutting hair since 1960. Where does he go at 78 years old? Charles stared into his coffee, memories flooding back. His own grandfather had been forced to sell the family farm when developers came through their small town. He remembered the old man sitting on the porch, tears in his eyes, talking about roots that couldn't be replanted. The profit margins are incredible, Dorothy. My partners are expecting. Your partners? Dorothy's voice was gentle but firm. Charlie, when was the last time you made a decision because it was right, not because it was profitable? She reached across and touched his weathered hand. I've watched you come in here for decades. You used to talk about your dreams, about building things that lasted, about making communities stronger. If this moment is touching your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. The weight of her words settled on Charles like a heavy blanket, and he realized he was standing at a crossroads that would determine everything. Charles pulled his hand away and stood up abruptly, pacing to the diner window. Outside, rain streaked the glass as people hurried past with umbrellas and newspapers over their heads. Regular folks heading to work, to school, to lives that would be turned upside down if he signed those papers. You don't understand, Dorothy. I've got investors, board members, people counting on me. If I back out now, I'll lose everything. Everything. Dorothy's voice was soft but penetrating. Or just money? The question hit him like a physical blow. Charles thought about his sprawling mansion that echoed with loneliness, his children who only called when they needed something, his friends who were really just business associates. Since Margaret's death, money was all he had left. It's not that simple. You can't run a business on feelings and good intentions. Dorothy stood and walked over to him. At barely 5 feet tall, she had to look up to meet his eyes, but her presence filled the space between them. Charlie, do you remember what you told me when you first started coming here? You said you wanted to build something your grandchildren would be proud of. Something that would make the world a little better. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. What would Margaret say if she were here right now? The mention of his late wife nearly buckled his knees. Margaret, who'd volunteered at soup kitchens and tutored children in the very neighborhood he was about to destroy. Margaret, who'd fallen in love with Charlie the carpenter, not Charles the billionaire. She'd probably tell me I'd lost my way, he whispered. She'd tell you it's never too late to find it again. Dorothy's hand found his arm. Charlie, I've served coffee to millionaires and maids, to politicians and plumbers. You know what I've learned? At the end of the day, we're all just people trying to do right by each other. Money comes and goes, but some decisions you have to live with forever. Charles felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built brick by brick over 40 years of deals and profits. He thought about the young man who'd once promised himself he'd never become the kind of person who put money over people. But the fear was overwhelming. $200 million. His entire reputation. His legacy. What if I make the wrong choice? He asked, his voice barely audible. Dorothy smiled, the same warm smile she'd given him for decades. Charlie, I think you already know what the right choice is. The question is, do you have the courage to make it? Have you ever faced a moment like this in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Charles looked at his watch. The city council meeting was in 2 hours. He had to decide now. Charles walked back to the booth and sat down heavily, staring at the development plans spread across the table. The numbers were staggering. Profit projections that would secure his company's future for generations. But Dorothy's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Margaret's gentle voice and his grandfather's tears on that long-ago porch. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed his lead attorney. Henderson, it's Charles. About the downtown project. I need you to prepare withdrawal papers. The silence on the other end was deafening. Sir, are you certain? The financial implications. Charles cut him off. Just prepare the papers. I'll be there in an hour. His business partners called within minutes, their voices ranging from confused to furious. "Whitman, you're making a $200 million mistake," his main investor shouted through the phone. "This deal will make us the most powerful development group in the region." But Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The knot in his stomach was loosening for the first time in weeks. Dorothy watched quietly as Charles made call after call, officially withdrawing from the project. She refilled his coffee cup and placed a slice of apple pie in front of him. "On the house," she said with a knowing smile. "You look like you could use some comfort food." "Dorothy," Charles said, looking up at her with clearer eyes than she'd seen in years, "I want to do something. The community center where your grandson learned to read, it needs renovations, doesn't it?" She nodded, surprised. "And Mrs. Rodriguez's building, the one with the garden, I heard the landlord wants to sell." Charles pulled out his checkbook. "What if instead of tearing down the neighborhood, we invested in making it better?" Dorothy's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Charlie, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that Margaret always wanted to build a community library. And that old barbershop where Mr. Franklin works, he probably needs help with his rent." Charles began writing, his pen moving with purpose for the first time in months. $200 million can destroy a neighborhood, Dorothy. But it can also save one. Tears streamed down Dorothy's weathered cheeks as she watched this powerful man rediscover his heart. "Margaret would be so proud of you," she whispered. If you're enjoying this story of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales like this one. Charles looked out the window again, but this time he saw possibility instead of profit. The real work was just beginning. 3 months later, Dorothy watched from the diner window as construction crews worked on the new community library. But these weren't demolition teams, these were builders, craftsmen working to strengthen the neighborhood rather than tear it down. The building rose slowly, carefully, with input from residents who would actually use it. Charles had insisted on that. Mr. Franklin's barbershop now sported a fresh coat of paint and new equipment, but the old barber still told the same stories and cut hair the same way he had for decades. Mrs. Rodriguez's garden had expanded, becoming a community space where children played while their parents tended vegetables and flowers. The community center buzzed with activity, after-school programs, senior citizen meals, and literacy classes that Dorothy helped teach twice a week. Charles still came to Murphy's Diner every Tuesday morning, but something fundamental had changed. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, and he smiled more often. His children had started calling again, curious about their father's sudden transformation. "Dad, people are saying you turned down the biggest deal of your career," his daughter had said during their first real conversation in years. "Why?" "Because I remembered who I used to be," he'd answered. "And I liked that person better." The financial hit had been substantial: $200 million in potential profits, partnerships dissolved, and some investors who'd never speak to him again. But Charles's construction company was busier than ever, taking on smaller projects that built communities instead of destroying them. The profit margins were smaller, but the satisfaction was immeasurable. On this particular Tuesday, Dorothy noticed Charles wasn't alone. A young woman sat across from him, notebook in hand, asking questions about sustainable development and community-focused construction. "This is my granddaughter, Rebecca," Charles explained proudly. "She's studying urban planning, wants to join the family business." Rebecca smiled warmly, and Dorothy could see the same spark in her eyes that Charles had carried as a young man. "She reminds me of someone I used to know," Dorothy said with a wink, refilling both their coffee cups. As Charles left that day, he pressed an envelope into Dorothy's hands. Inside was a deed to the diner building itself, which had been scheduled for demolition in the original development plan. "Some things are too precious to lose," the note read. "Thank you for helping me remember what really matters. Your friend, Charlie." If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the power of human connection and second chances. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Sometimes the most valuable advice comes from the most unexpected places.